something?
Chassid from liquid.
Okay, fine. Okay, so let's learn. So first of all, shkayach to sponsor a chassid from Lakewood. Okay, this for him. Kihilo, Klal Yisrael, shall you see good things? Simcha, bracha, nachas. Okay, so last week, for the summer, we started a shtickle mini series about going through different inyanim, different aspects of, I guess, society that maybe would be different in Eretz Yisrael if it was following the path of Halacha and Shulchan Aruch. Again, as Hashem. So we're not even talking about like Mashiach. Even things that are not like Mashiach oriented and things that are not, post Mashiach, even things that are Negeah Bizman Hazeh. But what would it look like? What would it look like if it was? What does the Torah say about these things and how it would function? That's part of Tzipis Yeshua, like I mentioned last time. It's not only it's sort of to envision Geula. It's not this like far off theoretical universe. It's like it's real. It's real, and there's. And part of the avodah, this sugya by itself, part of the avodah of Mashiach ben Yosef, for example, is to sort of, to see how Gul is something that is not foreign, and it already during Golus, Golus versus Gul is not, the setup of the world in Golus could also fit in that path that leads to Gula. So that's what we started speaking about last week. So we talked about last week about customs and who will be allowed entrance into the land, who would not be allowed entrance into the land, Shita Rambam, and so on. So I figured this week it's Reish Shachal by for Tisha B'Av, so I figured it'll be it's okay to talk about maybe a topic that's maybe not as exciting, not as pleasant. Unfortunately, before Mashiach comes, one of the inyanim that all society has to deal with is criminals, people that don't necessarily try to color within the lines. And so one of the things that as a society every society has to learn how to handle is how to handle criminals, how to handle people that break the law, and have a justice system. And specifically in modern times for sure, even in ancient times, the response or whatever, the mechanism in place to deal with criminals, and so was prison. It still is prison. And so that's the question I want to deal with this morning, just for a little bit. In Halacha, it's an interesting sugya. Is there such an idea as prison in Torah? Is there such an idea of prison in Torah? We know that according to Torah, there's different punishments that a person can get for certain violations. There's malchus, there's monetary knossos, there's capital punishment. Obviously rare occasions. Is there such a musig as prison? Is there such a thing? So we'll see about that. Say it again. So Mitzvah is not called prison, right? He's mechutz l'machna. He's kicked out of the
once he's in between the Knesset the first time, the second time, and it's lashon.
Right. So it's a lashon of Hasker and Muchla, right? But it's not like imprisoned in a cage. He was saying he's not like that. He's just not allowed into the machna. He could have a huge mansion, it doesn't. He's not limited to. He's not in prison like that. He's off limits to a certain area that we have. But this idea of Beis Yisur, is that an idea? Does that come from something? Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of background. So it's like this. In Chumash, we find pretty much 3 places that an idea of Beis Yisur, of someone being in prison, is mentioned. 2 of them are more obvious, and the last one a little bit less so obvious. The 2 obvious ones, the more apparent ones, is 2 stories that happened in Sefer B'Midbar. We just had it a few weeks ago. One event is the Mekaishish. So it says in Pasuk at the end of Parshas Kairach that there's a person that does it's sort of out of nowhere. He's Mechal Shabbos. Whatever type of malach he does, that's the discussion in Chazal. This person was Mechal Shabbos. So it says in Pasuk that they took this Mekaishish and they imprisoned him. Ladas, in order to figure out what to do with him, they imprisoned him first. That's what it says by the Mekaishish. Similarly, it says also regarding another situation of the Megadef. There was a person also that also out of nowhere a little bit, he came and he cursed Hashem, which is a violation of Giduf. It's one of the, it's also a capital punishment. And also it says in Pasuk, Vayenechu b'mishmar, that they placed him in a mishmar, in a prison. Ladas, again, also that was where he was kept until they were able to follow through with the halacha. Both those cases were capital punishment. Makaish Chol Shabbos is chayiv misa. Magadev is also chayiv misa. And both those situations, the person was imprisoned until until the einish was carried out. Those are the two more obvious references. The last one, which is a little bit less so obvious, is in the beginning of Parshas Mishpatim. So the pasuk says, it's one of those psukim that for some reason everyone says along with the Chazan or with the Balkaira, So it says in pasuk over there, the end of the first aliyah of Parshas Mishpatim, v'chiriv and anoshim. If you have two people fighting with each other, one person hits the other, one Jew hits the other Jew with a serious blow. V'lo yomus, the victim did not die right away. But he's sick. He's hospitalized and so on. So now you're in a situation of where is this a capital punishment or not? We're not sure. We have to see what happens with the victim. If he ends up, so says the pasuk, if he ends up being killed, then that means that was an act of ritzicha, and then the perpetrator is chayiv misa. If it was just wounded and he ends up getting better, so then he's chayiv to pay monetary damages, but it's not a capital case. Says the pasuk, im yakum v'salach b'chutz. If the victim eventually makes his way out of bed and he walks around, in other words, he becomes healthy, al mashanta, even if he's hobbling along, but he's not, he doesn't die, the nika hamaka, then the one that hits is free to go. The nika hamaka, rak shifta yitin v'rapri, he has to pay the medical bills and so on, he has to pay the damages, but he's free to go. Free to go, where was he? So the indication of the word v'nika hamaka is that he was being imprisoned. And so those are the places that we have a reference to this idea of being chavish b'beis yisurim. So now this is not just something. So listen, we would not be able to learn halacha from Chumash like that, but Chazal had traditions and they had the keys to do so. So in fact, we have Mishnayos and Gemaras in Sanhedrin that tell us an idea of a person being imprisoned based on these stories, based on these psukim that I just mentioned. So let's see Maramuk and one inside. Again, what we're going to see this morning are three different types of situations where imprisonment is considered to be something that is within the boundaries of halacha. Three different situations. The first situation that we're going to deal with right now, based on those stories that I just mentioned in Chumash, is imprisoning someone until you carry out the punishment. In other words, so let's say by the case of the Makaishesh or the Magadev or the person that hits the other Jew, the end of in Parshas Mishpatim, all those three situations, there's an imprisonment taking place as sort of waiting until you carry out the real verdict, which is Chiyav Misa. So let's say by the Magadev it was like that, the Makaishesh was like that. And so this story in Parshas Mishpatim is, at least you're holding the person in prison. You're not sure if he's chayiv misa yet, but it's a strong possibility, and so you're imprisoning him until that becomes clarified. So let's see in halacha. So Maramuk number one, this is a Gemara in Sanhedrin, Ayin Chesem Beis. Now the context of the Gemara over there is not important for us. Basically, there's a machlokes between the Rabbanon and Rab Nechemia regarding that story that Parshas Mishpatim talks about, one Jew hitting another and so on. What the machlokes is not relevant for us, but the point that we're going to have is as follows. For Rabbanon, according to Rabbanon, Hai v'nika hamaka my darshiva. Sometimes you have this in the Gemara where the Gemara has a machlokes between two opinions, and sort of each one reads through a pasuk and darshans each part of the pasuk differently than the other. So that's the context over there. So the Gemara says like this: according to Rabbanon, the words v'nika hamaka, that the one that hits is free to go, my darshiva. What did they learn from that statement? So says the Gemara, the Rabbanan learned from that statement, V'nika hamaka, v'lami chechayv shenaisa, a halacha forever, that when you have someone who committed a crime, committed an aveira, that might end up being capital punishment, so until it becomes clear, either way, the person's in prison. Similar to the story by Parshas Mishpatim. And the Rabbanan Chacham are saying, from that pasuk we learn l'doiris that that's the halacha. So a person commits an aveira, and certainly if they're chayav misa already, you imprison them until the chayav misa takes place. But even similar to the case of Parshas Mishpatim, where they did something you're not sure yet it was a chayav misa. If it's a vadei, the person's certainly chayav misa or possibly chayav misa. There's a halacha that the person's imprisoned until either you carry out the Chiyuv Misa or you can clarify whether he's Chayiv Misa or not. That holding period, there's a Chiyuv to imprison the person, and that's learned out from the Pasuk, V'nika Hamaka. That's the Chachamim. For Rab Nechemia, it says the Gemara, and according to Rab Nechemia, who, again, in the context of the Gemara, V'nika Hamaka is used for something else. So Rab Nechemia Chavisha Minalei, and according to the Gemara, assumes that this concept is accepted by everybody. So where does Rab Nechemia know this idea of imprisoning someone? So says the Gemara, okay, so he doesn't learn it from the story of Mishpatim, Yalfim Mekaishish. He learns it out from the story of the Mekaishish. Okay. In other words, says, okay, 1 second, that's a pretty good, straightforward Makar. The guy was Mechal Shabbos, and they imprisoned him until he was killed. So why would the Rabbanan, according to Rabbanan, why do you need the V'nika Hamaka for? By Mishpatim, learn it from the Mekaishish. So says the Gemara, the Chachamim say, no, Mekaishish Bar Ketolu. The case of the Mekaishish, that you could learn from the Mekaishish, but you're not going to know as much as you would if you learned from the story of Mishpatim. Why? Because the Mekaishish for sure was Chayiv Misa. When the person was Mechal Shabbos, Moshe knew that he's Chayiv Misa. It's just a matter of, of carrying out. So then, from the Mekaishish, all you would know is that someone who's for sure Chayiv Misa, there's a halach of imprisoning him until he's killed. Over there was some level of doubt. The only doubt was what type of capital punishment he should be given. Skila, hereg, and that's why the Rebbeinu Shem had to reveal to them that for Chil Shabbos he gets skila. But Mechala Mois Yumas, that Moshe Rabbeinu knew that he's Chayiv Misa. Lafuke Hai, but by the case of Mishpatim, the Chiddush that the Chachamim say we still need Parshas Mishpatim for is because by the case of Parshas Mishpatim, where one Jew hits the other Nebuch, we're not sure yet if he's Chayiv Misa. So this is where the Chachamim say. So you want to learn from the Mekaishish tells you something that's relatively obvious. That if a person is already Chayiv Misa, he's imprisoned until the Misa is carried out. But let's say you're not sure if he's Chayiv Misa. That's where you need the V'nika Hamaka.
Is it saying where these holding pens or prisons are supposed to be located?
So there's no indication of where it's supposed to be. It doesn't have to be like Mitzara, Michutz L'Machna. That there's no indication. What we will find later on is maybe more of a description of what the prison looks like. But where the location is not doesn't say. There's no halacha that defines that. So it says the Gemara like this. Lafuki Hai, again, that's why the Chachamim say we still need Parshas Mishpatim, Dolo Yadinani Bar Ketolu, we love Bar Ketolu, because Netzachim. We don't even know, we're not sure if he's Chayiv Misa yet. And that's why you need Mishpatim, V'nika Hamaka, to tell you that in that case also the person's in prison. Rab Nechemia, Rab Nechemia says, okay, that's a good point. So says Rab Nechemia, I can't just rely on Mekaishish. Mekaishish doesn't tell me enough. So says the Gemara, Yalfi Magadev. Rab Nechemia says, okay, there's another, the third story in Chumash, that can tell you something pretty expansive, and that's the story of the Megadef. By the Megadef, for the person cursed Hashem, they didn't know yet whether he was Chayiv Misa or not. The halacha that cursing Hashem results in Chayiv Misa was taka not known. That's what was told to them after that story. So the pasuk says that the Megadef was imprisoned. It says Rabbi Nechemia. So from there you see, not only like the Mekaishish that someone who is for sure Chayiv Misa is imprisoned, but even the Megadef, who at that time it wasn't known that he's Chayiv Misa, is still imprisoned. And they still imprisoned him. The Rabbanan say, no, you can't learn out from the Megadef. Why? Megadef Hara Shahisa. The Megadef was just a Hara Shah. It was something that was a one-time deal. Moshe Rabbeinu Ruach HaKodesh understood that that's what this person needs right now. He needs to be in prison. But to learn from there forever, that is inappropriate. Why? So says Rashi over there, the next line, Rashi over there says, the kivan b'sham nemer ba, it's a mistake. The kivan dolay nemer ba misa mitchila. Since by the Megadef, Moshe Rabbeinu Klal Yisrael never heard that there was such a thing as being chayiv misa for cursing Hashem. Ma safek oilam hatal safek misa l'chayvshay. Then, after the fact, hindsight's 20/20. So now we know that a Megadef is chayiv misa. But at that time, there would be no reason in anyone's mind to think that someone that blasphemes, someone that curses Hashem is chayiv misa. And so the fact that they imprisoned him, in their thinking at that time, there was absolutely no reason to think of a chayiv misa. So why are they imprisoning him? So it must be that it was just a hirasha. In other words, what the assumption that the Gemara is working with is the following idea: that this idea of imprisoning someone until the actual punishment that they deserve is carried out, for whatever reason, Chazal had this assumption and this tradition that idea of imprisoning until the punishment that they deserve is carried out is something that should only be for capital cases. Capital cases that the guy's for sure chayiv, like the Mekayjish, or a possibility of a capital case, like the story of Parshas Mishpatim. But a situation where there's no reason to think that this is a capital situation, a capital case, then the Chachamim understood that there's no reason for there to be this idea of imprisonment. But this is the first yesod that we find in Chazal, a place for imprisonment, which is a person does something that's he's chayiv misa, or at least possibly chayiv misa, and he just needs time, or we need to figure things out. Then there's an idea of not just there's no, it's not an issue of bail, and it's not an issue of other things. The person has to be imprisoned until he's actually killed, or at least we figure out whether he's actually chayiv misa or not. But in that context, that's the idea of imprisonment.
Would it be right to say that it's only because it's not as a punishment like we do today? It's only for practical reasons?
So we're going to see about that. So we're going to see very, very soon what the reason for this is, and we'll see. But you're touching on something. So let's slowly. Now, fine. We have this idea. Next step. How much? That's an interesting question. Again, obviously, we're not. These are broad ideas and general topics. It's going to be hard to get into specifics. But the next question that we do find Chazal deal with is that how much evidence has to be in place in order to warrant an imprisonment. In other words, we know that when it comes to capital punishment, in order to carry that out, it has to be mamish, like two witnesses, hasra. The person has to accept the hasra verbally. Like Chazal famously say that any bezdin that killed more than once in 7 years, in 70, whatever, it's considered to be malpractice. So it was very, very rare. The question is, how much evidence though does one need in order to at least imprison the person to then figure things out more? So what's that initial step? So that's a Yerushalmi. There's a Yerushalmi in Masechet Sanhedrin, Perek Zayin, Halacha Ches. So the Yerushalmi says like this. It's a little bit hard to read and understand the Yerushalmi, but I'll read it the way the Rishonim interpret it. The Yerushalmi says like this: Hey Chavida, what is the situation? What would warrant the person being imprisoned to at least give us the opportunity to investigate the situation further and to determine whether he's chayiv misa or not? So says the Gemara, Ploini haragas hanefesh. If there is the language of the Rishon, if there's a koil, if there is rumors, rumors, and it's going to be hard to say for a rumor, but not edus yet. You don't have edim testifying. Maybe a very strong suspicion that this guy committed that crime. What would warrant a strong suspicion? Circumstantial, whatever the situation is. I guess that's where it's a little bit vague. But if there's strong suspicion that this person, is the perpetrator, even if you don't have edim yet, because that's already the din Torah. That'll already be the next stage. But if you have enough strong feeling and indication that this is that this might be the guy, so yehi nidan atzei yavi edav, he should be judged. In other words, he should be imprisoned until then you get the edim, and then you actually go through the din Torah. That's the first statement of the Yerushalmi. Amar lei Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi, whoever said this, Rabbi Yossi says to him, "V'tafsin barnosha b'shuka umavazin lei." That's for just a strong suspicion. You're going to take a person from the street, arrest him in the street, and embarrass him like that, and imprison him. It's not enough. It's not enough. Ella Kani, rather, says Rabbi Yossi, this is the approach. Ploini harag es hanefesh harei edav shaharag es hanefesh yehi tovas achivo edav. If this is the way the Rishonim interpret it, is that in order to imprison the person, is that you already have to have edim, and the edim have to already testify. You have to testify that this person killed someone else, and that's already considered to be enough to imprison the person. And then there's a whole process of chakir v'drisha, of investigating and cross-examination and evidence and back and forth and Sanhedrin. It can take time, but you have to at least initially not just have circumstantial evidence or a strong indication or a feeling or a rumor. You have to have aid, just like you need aidim for actually Mises Bezdin. You need at least to be makabel kabbalah seidus in order to imprison. And once the person's imprisoned, okay, so now there's next steps. Again, like I said, investigating back and forth. But you need that initial step. This again, the Yerushalmi itself, the words are very unclear. But if you take a look at Maranach number 3, the Ran in Masechet Sanhedrin, this is how he interprets the Yerushalmi. The Nira mitaycha Yerushalmi. The Ran says it seems from the Yerushalmi regarding this halacha of imprisonment until a Chiyav Misa is carried out, or at least it's clarified, if he is Chayav Misa, Shemekivan Shabo Eidim, if there are witnesses that come, the Amru, when they testify, Lefnei Bezdin, Ploini Gide, if the Ploini cursed Hashem, or whatever the capital punishment is. Avol Bishlik Kibulei Dusam, even if we haven't formally accepted their Eidus yet. In other words, we still would have to question them and back and forth, but there's at least that initial stage of, okay, two kosher Eidim that, without too much investigation, seem to be saying something that sounds legitimate. They are accusing this person of that, of verifying. That's enough to imprison. Chayv Shnai, so the person will be imprisoned. Avam loibo eidim ufenenu, but if the eidim are not here, ein bedin l'chayv shay. That's what Yerushalmi says. It's inappropriate to imprison the person, u'levazai seichinim, and to embarrass him in such a way. That's what Yerushalmi says.
Is there some sort of time limit on the bed thing, or is he stuck in prison indefinitely?
No, so that we have halachas. There's already halachas in place in Masechus Sanhedrin, the Rambam of Inoi Hadin. There is a halacha that once a din Torah has begun, for monetary stuff, it could drag on. But for din nefashis, there's a special hakpah that Chazal have that once a din starts, chik-chak, it has to be done properly, like the first mission in Pirkei Avos, right? The Anshe Knesset Gdela said, have mesunim adin, there should be patience and seriousness and to investigate properly. But no laziness. It has to go quick. It has to go quick. So that we do have. So it's not going to be such a long time. I mean, again, situations come up where things can be delayed. If there's a witness that needs to be called and he's away, the situations come up. But that's we want to make this quick as possible. Okay. So now the next question is, what is the purpose of this imprisonment? So this is the idea. We have this idea of being imprisoned until the Chiyav Misa takes place, or during the trial of the Chiyav Misa. Why? So it's Machlokes Rishonim. If you take a look at Maramok number 4, Rashi in Masechus Sanhedrin over there in Daf Ayin Ches Mem Beis, he says a few words to explain Chayv Shenes Hamaka, referencing this Gemara that the person, again, like the story of Mishpatim, one Jew hits the other, so you imprison the person. Kadesh Liyavrach, so you shouldn't run away. In other words, what Rashi's saying is there could be other, there could be other ways to keep a person, around. So you could put liens on his properties, you could do all sorts of monetary things, but when it comes to capital punishment, all the money in the world, we're afraid that the guy is going to, presumably he wants to live more than he wants his money. So there's always that concern of a flight risk. So in order to avoid that, that's this idea of imprisonment, and that's why it's only by Chiyav Misa, because that's, anything less than Chiyav Misa, we can use other strategies to keep the guy here. But when it comes to Chiyav Misa, the guy's going to try to find anything he can to get away. That's why the halacha is to imprison. That's Rashi. The Rivash, one of the more later Sfardi Shirishainim, so the Chuvas Rivash in Siman Reish Lamed Vav also talks about this. It's interesting. He was asked a shaila in his day. That's what we're talking about, way past Sanhedrin and Bezdin. He was asked a question about Stam imprisoning. Again, in those days, communities were like sort of self-governed, Jewish communities. So you had the leeway to sort of set up your system. So he was asked about the shaila of being of prison and how to set that up properly. So the Rivash in this context talks about this idea, and he says as follows: V'oid. So this idea he quotes: Shemisha avar aver sheish b'chashash chiyav misa. This, we have this idea, like we've been saying, that if a person violates an aver where there's a possibility of a chiyav misa in place, so ein roy sheyelech v'yatayel b'shuk ba'oid shebezdin ma'ayin v'noisin bedinai. Says the Rivash, not so much like Rashi that it's a matter of a flight risk. Says the Rivash be'etzem, it's inappropriate and it's not right that while Bezdin is investigating the terrible crime that this guy committed or might have committed, and he's just taking a spatzir in the street. It's inappropriate. And so says the Rivash like this: Ein roy sheyelech v'yitayel b'shuk. It's not right that he should just be walking in the street. At the same time, when Bezdin is investigating the terrible crime that he did, it's a chil Hashem almost. It's a zilzal. Maybe it's a disgrace for Bezdin. It's a disgrace for the situation. That's the idea. And says Rivash, this idea of why that's the reason to imprison is hinted to in the Medrash. The Medrash, again, going back to that pasuk in Parashas Mishpatim, the Nika Hamaka, right? That if the victim ends up surviving, then the one that did the hit is free to go. Yachol Yitein Aravim. So says the Medrash like this: maybe you would think that until that happens, maybe the person should give some sort of bail, v'yitayel b'shuk, and he should be allowed to walk in the street. Tamaloimers, that's what it says, v'nika hamaka, then that the person is held until it becomes clear that the victim is okay. So says the Rivash, why would the Mechilta say v'yitayel b'shok, to walk, to spazier in the street, whatever. The Medrash should say that without this pasuk, I would think that you could give some bail, that you shouldn't be a flight risk, and fine. V'yitayel b'shok, says Rivash, gives an indication that that's the issue. The issue is that like such a heavy thing is weighing upon the person, and he's just walking around as if it's a regular Tuesday. It's not befitting the situation that the person is under. He should be in such a situation. So it's interesting. We have to investigate. Maybe at the end when we get into a little bit of penimiyus, we'll figure that out. What type of svara is that? Again, according to Rashi, it's simple. There's a flight risk, so we want to make sure the guy doesn't go anywhere. But this idea that the Rivash is introducing to us, which is like it's not right. It's inappropriate that such an Indian is going on in his life and he's not walking around. We have to explain what that is. Explain exactly more better, but that's maybe at the end we'll see.
In the midbar, there's a chashash that he was run away.
Say it again.
In the midbar,
right?
They had the chashash that
it's interesting, right? The Anania covered. I don't know. You couldn't get in. I don't know if you can get out. So I'm not sure. Yeah, you have Moshe Rabbeinu there. It's hard to. He has good eyes. So I don't know. The Acharon do point this out, by the way, that it could be that in Rashi, see, according to Rashi, that it's because of again a flight risk. So even though it's true that we would assume that liens on property and so on would probably not be good enough when we're talking about capital punishment, but the Acharon do talk about that in Rashi. If we can figure out other ways, if you take away his passport, there could be theoretically other ways to stop a person from getting something, to getting away without imprisonment. So maybe according to Rashi that would work. According to Rashi, there's no like din be'etzem. It's not like a halacha l'meish misina or something. Like it has to be this way. It's just a practical way of keeping the guy here. If you can come up with other ways, then fine. In the Rivash, it's more be'etzem. So in the Rivash's world, even if you could figure out ways to make sure, or this particular guy, we know he's not going anywhere, whatever the situation is, in the Rivash there's something be'etzem. That there's an end of being chavish of Beis Yisurim while the din Torah for Chiyav Mises Bezin is being worked through.
Is it mitzvah though? Is it out there or mitzvah for out there for the?
So it's a little bit unclear. It sounds like it's something. It's a little bit unclear.
To make the mice a light.
Right. To make the mice right. It shouldn't be. It's a belittling of the situation. Like the person has to reflect the situation that's hanging over him. Like you shouldn't be oblivious to what's going on, something like that. We have to be masber more. It's a little bit unclear.
I think the guy acted uncivilly, so the only guy who's acting uncivilly is to be just amongst regular people. I think it's like
so
isolate, people that are.
So okay, so that we're going to see a little bit later on. We're not necessarily talking about someone who is a risk to society or a danger to society. A person who was machal Shabbos, he's not allowed to have a danger to society. Tzicha might be. But not always, most Chiyav Mises, Arayas and things like that is something. So it's an Indian of the Yitayel B'Shuk. Okay. That's all situation number one of imprisonment, which is again holding a person until the Chiyav Mises is carried out or if it's clarified. But we have another situation, halacha, of being imprisoned, and which is the following thing. Again, it's not the most pleasant subject. That's why I waited for the week of Tisha B'Av to talk about. It's tired. So. It's like this. Marmuk number 6 is a Rashi Meseches Pesachim. It's how the Aleph and Aleph. The Gemara Pesachim over there. Again, the context of the Gemara is not Negeya for us. It's talking about bringing a Korban Pesach for someone that's not around, right? So every Jew has to bring a Korban Pesach. Let's say the guy's not around, so he makes a shliach to bring a Korban Pesach for him. That's the context of the Gemara. But what's interesting is the Gemara says a situation of like, where is this guy? Like, why is he not showing up himself? So the Gemara says an interesting thing. The Gemara says maybe he's in a Beis Yisur, maybe he's in prison. And the Gemara says two things. Maybe he's a possibility that the person's in a Beis Yisurim Shel Akum, a non-Jewish prison, and maybe he's in a Beis Yisurim Shel Yisrael, or maybe he's in a Jewish prison. So Rashi says Jewish prison. Like what? I never heard that before. So it says Rashi like this. Rashi Pesachim Tzadi Aleph and Aleph. Beis Yisurim Shel Yisrael. What does it mean? A Jewish prison. Daf Yomi, like what does it make? What makes it a Jewish prison? So Kagain, so it says Rashi. The example is l'koifei l'haitzi isha psula, or l'shalom mamen. Says Rashi, inami k'netani yakum v'salach b'chutz. So at the end, Rashi says, okay, an example of being imprisoned al pi Torah is what we've talked until now. Person maybe did something that's chayiv misa. He has to be held until it becomes clarified. Im Yakum Esalach B'chutz, like the story in Parshas Mishpatim. But the first couple lines of Rashi says there's another situation of being imprisoned, which is as a way of enforcing and compelling the person to do what he has to do. So the example is, if a person has to give a get to his wife and he's not doing that, Halacha, there are situations where it has to be done and he's not. So one of the ways to compel him, you could break his knees, but another way is to imprison him. And so you imprison him as a way of compelling him to do what he has to do. To divorce a woman that he's not allowed to be married to, that's one way to do it. Or another situation, if a person has a debt and he's not paying. So also that could be a tactic in order to get him to pay, is to imprison him. It's a chiddush from Rashi. Rashi says these are the two. So what we're being introduced to in Rashi is this new concept of Beis Yisurim as not a holding cell until, that it's actually a way of compulsion, that if someone has to do what Bezdin does, is not listening to halacha, this is another way of enforcing halacha. Now this idea of imprisoning someone to compel them to divorce or nisha that they're not allowed to marry, that seems to be accepted. The question is the next example that Rashi gave, which is imprisoning someone in order that they should pay up a debt that they owe. That's a big shiloh. That's a big shiloh in the Rishonim. Even in Shulchan Aruch, it's a big question. So I'll give you some of the background. Rashi was not clear. Rashi wasn't clear what situation exactly would warrant imprisonment as a way of compelling the guy to pay his debts. That Rashi just said vaguely. But in the Rishonim, we have the following idea. Take a look at Marmuk, there were 7. This is Shuvas HaRosh, the Rosh in Shuvas, so Klas Amaches Eis Yud. So the Rosh says the following thing. Again, he was also asked the Shaila about someone who, owed money and was refusing to pay, and what do we do about it? So he says like this, Dover Baru, says the Rosh, it's clear and it's obvious. Shemein l'loiv mammon, that if the person, let's say the borrower, or the person that owes the money, if he doesn't have any money to pay, lefruye, he doesn't have the money to pay back, lo yitvei samal v'gufe shaloiv, and there's no reason for the person to be put in prison. So if the guy is not paying his debt, the question is why? So says the Rosh, if he's not paying because he can't afford it, or he doesn't have the money, doesn't have the funds, okay, so you don't imprison the person. Says the Rosh, even if the guy when they made the document, the shtar, he says, and if I don't pay, take me away. Says the Rosh is meaningless. Those words don't mean anything. He's not in charge of that, and there's no such idea. There's no such thing as giving yourself over to the Malva, like now I'm yours, or now there's no such idea. Therefore, they should not. I'm sorry, there's a little mistake. It was late at night. Why? Bechla says the Rosh, why would you imprison him? L'shtabed boy and Rishai, that he should become your butler. There's no such idea. L'yasser and stamp to punish him, to make him crazy, and which is also not meaningless. So says the Rosh, if the person is not paying because he doesn't have what to pay, then certainly there's no idea of imprisonment. The indication being in the Shulchan Aruch, it's quoted in Shulchan Aruch, the indication being, but if the guy does have funds, right, and he's just not being obstinate, and he's not doing what he's supposed to do, then this can be a form of compulsion. So it could be other ways of compelling the person, and this could be one form. So that's what's known in the Achronim, the sheet of the Rosh, which is that the sheet of the Rosh is that if the person does not have, as a punishment, stam, because you borrowed money and you can't pay back, there's no such thing. Imprisonment is not a punishment like that. But as a way of compelling a person to do what they have to do, so then it could be an eitzah, like Rashi said. And so therefore, if the person has means to pay back, and he's not, so this can be a way of forcing the person. Just like, again, like the other situation that Rashi gave, the person's supposed to give a get, and they're not. That could also be a way of imprisoning to get the person to eventually agree. So that's the sheet of the Rosh. What's interesting is that there's a dissenting view of the Rashba. In Marmukah number 8, the Rashba in Shuvas, in Chelik Aleph, Siman Aleph Samach Tes. So the Rashba, the case of the Rashba, from the answer, it's not clear, but in the context of the question, the Rashba was asked about a situation of a person who had funds to pay back a debt, and he just wasn't. And so the question that was asked to the Rashba is like, what do we do about it? Like, what are we allowed to do as a bezdin to get this guy to pay his debts? And again, the situation is that he was being bayreach. In other words, he had the funds to pay back, but he wasn't doing what he's supposed to do. So the Rashba goes through in that tshuva different things, different eitzes that the bezdin can try to do. And one of the suggestions that was made to the Rashba is what about imprisonment? So says the Rashba like this: Ein haguf meshubed. The person's body is not like that. There's no such idea. There's no such idea of imprisoning a person as a way of getting him to to do what he has to do. Right? There is an idea that a person back in the times of Yovel and so on, a person stole, couldn't get back from there, sold as an Eved Ivri. But that's a separate category. That's halachas of Eved Ivri. We don't have that nowadays anyway. We're talking about just I'm imprisoning a person. Says the Raj, but there is no such idea. There simply is no such idea. Again, by the times of Yovel and so on, by the times of an Eved Ivri, there was such an idea of selling a person as an Eved Ivri that he should pay back his debts. But Stam as a way of imprisoning, that he should be compelled to do the right thing, says the Rashba, there is no such idea in Torah. He owes him money, so you have to figure out other ways, whatever it is. But this idea is not. There is no idea. So the Rashba is fundamentally disagreeing with this entire subcategory. There is no such idea as imprisoning as a way of compulsion. There's no such idea. So it's an interesting thing. Again, so what we have so far is one type of imprisonment, which is holding a person until the Chiyuv Misa is carried out, or at least until it's clarified what's the Chiyuv Misa Inyan. And now we have this other category of what imprisonment as a way of compelling the person to do the right thing, and that's a debate. Does such a thing exist? According to Rashi and according to the Rosh, such an idea exists. According to the Rashba, such a thing does not. There's no such idea. There's simply no such idea. The person, you have to figure out other ways, but to imprison someone, such an idea doesn't exist.
So the Rashba agreed that if he's married to Isha Psula, that can be
Lav dafka. But that's not. Listen. I can't say for sure. He's talking about Mammon. So it's not clear. I can't say for sure. But the Rashba in the context of tshuva, he uses language of like there's no such idea. You know what I mean? So it would seem to indicate that he's rejecting the entire idea. When the Gemara says in Psachim, the example of a person in a Jewish prison, the Rashba can just say the final example of Rashi, which is maybe the guy did something that's maybe Chayiv Misa and he's being held. But this idea of imprison as a way of getting him to do what he has to do, the Pashas in the Rashba is that there's simply no such idea. That's Machlekes. Okay. Final example of Beis Yisurim, maybe the most unpleasant, but okay, it is. Like I said, it's Torah. The final example is also in the context of Chiyuv Misa, sort of, and it's based on a number of Mishnayos and Maseches Sanhedrin. So I didn't want to bog you down with all the Mishnayos, but just the Rambam brings it all down for us. So in Maramakim number 9 is a Rambam in Hilchos Ritzeach, Perek Daled, Halacha Ches to Halacha Tes, and this is what the Rambam says. We know, like I mentioned before, when it comes to Chiyuv Misa, it's very, very hard to make a person Chayiv Misa in Bezdin. It has to be an extremely tight window, Obviously, only certain Averis are Chayiv Misa. It has to be kosher Eidim. They have to give Hasra. The person has to, by the way, with Hasra, the person has to respond verbally to the warning, of the warning, with the words, I understand what you're saying, I accept, and Al Minas Kain Ani Oisa, and I'm doing this to be killed in bed. He has to mamish, nodding his head is not enough. It has to be mamish, obvious and clear as Makalas. It's very, very difficult. So, but the Rambam says like this: Al Harig Nefashis. Now you have to be, as we know, with the Rambam, the language is always very particular. It says Rambam, Al Harig Nefashis, someone who kills people. In other words, the indication is that whatever he's about to talk about is not just, God forbid, a murderer, someone that's
serial killer.
Something like that. He's a ritzeach. That's his title. You know what I mean? That's what he does. Not a harig nefashos. V'loy hayu shnei edim. But there's no two edim. He's doing good at what he does. He's not going to be in front of edim. Ryan Isai ka'achas. Or by the way, also like I mentioned, when the two edim, they both have to seem together. If you have one aid from this place and one aid from that place, it's also no good. So it has to be, again, it's very, very difficult. So if you have a person that's harig nefashos, and you don't have edim that witness it together, let's say there even were edim, but there was no hasra, and whatever the situation is that makes it impossible to actually carry out Chiyuv Misa, but we know that he's a ratzchan, he's a murderer like this. Kol elu haratzchanin, all these types of people that are killers. So he says, what do we do with them? So this is a halacha mashmisina. Again, it's coming from Mishnayos and Sanhedrin. It's halacha mashmisina. We imprison them. You can't give Mises Bezdin. the formal thing of skila and so on, that you can't do. But we imprison them, and we put them in a situation where they are killed, but not misas bezin. What do we do? So it's interesting. We give them very just bare food to survive. To the point of where their stomach shrinks and they become, very, very skinny and so on. And then we give them certain types of food made of barley and so on, which is not good for such a small stomach, and eventually they die because of that. So it's not a I don't know what's exactly a better way to go, whether it be hereg or skila or this. I'm not sure, but lo leinu. But that's the halacha. So we imprison the person, and we kill him basically, but without going through misas bezin like that. Now says the Rambam, the ein oisim davar is that l'shar mechuyavi misas bezin. We don't do this for any other aveira that would require misas bezdin except for ritzicha. And like I said, even for ritzicha, the language of the Rambam is the person has to be a ratzchan, not just a one-time deal. It has to be clear that this is what this guy does. Like he's a murderer like that. El nischayev misa, rather, by other situations, if the guy is chayev misa legitimately with all the stipulations of bezdin, mamisa nicer, then you carry out capital punishment. Then eina chayev misa, and if something went wrong with asra or whatever it is, and it didn't work out, then point to nicer, then it's for you to go. Like this is what we do. And says the Rambam, and I'm not saying because shlichas dam murder is between in Shemayim is the most severe. There could be other averes that maybe in Shemayim are worse. That's not the point. But it doesn't break down society like Ritzicha does. This guy is a ratzchan. He's a menace to society. You can't have him walk around. So to keep society functional, we have to take care of this person, and that's the mahalach imprisonment, and you take care of him in prison. That's the Rambam. So again, from this Rambam, it would say the Rambam's clear that there's a new idea, a new sugya category of imprisonment, which is not a holding pin until chiyuv misa, and not a way of compelling him to do the right thing, which was questionable. But there's a new thing, which is by itself a way of taking care of this guy.
Where did Rambam get that from?
So these are Mishnayos in Sanhedrin. There's a few Mishnayos. There's about 3 Mishnayos in Sanhedrin that give situations like this. The Mishnayos themselves, they come from Halacha Meshmi Sinai. So it's Halacha Meshmi Sinai that such a thing is possible, but that's where it goes. Halacha Meshmi Sinai recorded Mishnayos, and Rambam's bringing it down from Mishnayos. Now but here's the problem. Like with every Rambam, there's always a stira. So there's another. This was in Hilchos Ritzeach. There's another Rambam in Hilchos Sanhedrin. Okay, and also based on Mishnayos. But the Rambam in Hilchos Sanhedrin, Perek Ches Halacha says the following thing: Mi sha'avar al iser kares. If a person violated, it's interesting. Not even in Mises Bezdin, right? There's certain halachas. Averis come with Mises Bezdin. A person didn't violate that, but they violated, God forbid, an avera which carries kares. Right? Kares is a punishment min hashemayim. The person's cut off, whatever the different ways, but whatever the kares is, there's such a punishment from Shemayim called kares. A person violated that, oy Mises Bezdin, or a person violated an avera which would be a capital case, the hisrubai, and they gave him hasra, they gave him warning. Now, by the way, when it comes to kares, you should know there is a punishment that Chazal would give, that Bezdin would give for kares, not capital punishment, but malchus. Chazal say, even an amazing thing, Chazal say that it was the biggest benefit for the guy that violated an aver for kares, the biggest benefit was to give him malchus. Because the Gemara says, the tradition that we have is, that a person that's chayiv kares, malchus takes care of the kares. So it would be a lot, by the way, a little bit just on the side, it's well known that in Tzfat in the late 1500s or so, there was a big movement to make a Sanhedrin, to reestablish a Sanhedrin. And so there was a big tumult between the Yishuv and Tzfat. The 2 big Yishuvim at the time was Tzfat and Yerushalayim. Tzfat was bigger, but Tzfat and Yerushalayim. There was a big tumult back and forth. The Chacham of Yerushalayim disagreed with this, the Chacham of Tzfat wanted to. And so one of the big issues was like, why are you doing this? Like, what is that? Like, why are you trying to make a Sanhedrin? What's your motivation? And so one of the official reasons that was given is because there was a tremendous influx of people at that time coming from the Spanish Inquisition. And so a lot of them, Nebuch, it was an oinus, but a lot of them committed averis, but the Zara and so on. under the Spanish Inquisition. And so a lot of them came to Tzfat and they wanted a kapara because they felt that they had oinshim of karis on them and who knows what. So one of the reasons is, so they said, the Chama of Tzfat said, listen, let's make a bet. If we could reestablish the Sanhedrin, that means we could give Malchus. And if we could give them Malchus, then they could be putter from their karis. That was one of the reasons that was floating around. The Chama of Yerushalayim said, first, the whole thing is mamash tayis. First of all, they're not chayiv karis. It was an oinus. That's number one. Number two, in order to give Malchus, it has to be Hasra, Edom. You don't have that anyway. So the whole thing is, so the truth is that was just a front. The real reason is because they wanted to bring Mashiach. And there was and you need a Sanhedrin, it was an auspicious time for Gula. But anyway, Balkapanim, there's this idea that a person is Chayiv Karis, and they're, Karis, they're a klal, there's, there are only two examples of Karis which come from a lack of a positive mitzvah. And that's Mila and Pesach. Right? If a person doesn't give himself a bris milah or doesn't bring a korban pesach, so it's a chiyuv karis. But every other chiyuv karis comes with a lav, and whenever you're dealing with a lav on that level of karis, theoretically you could be given malchus too if there's hasra and so on. So that's the situation. So it says the Rambam again, going back to Maramuk number 10. A guy violates an isser of karis or violates an isser of misas bezdin, the hisru by, and there's witnesses, there's hasra, but here's the problem: the hirkin beroish. The person didn't respond verbally to the hasra by saying, yes, I hear you. Rather, he just nodded his head, which for every other thing would be good enough, but for Malchus and Mises Bezdin, that's not good enough. Or even he just was quiet, which again, shtika kaida usually, but not for these situations. He didn't verbally accept the hasra, so it says the Rambam, ain't organized, so finished. You can't kill him. They Malchus, you can't give him Malchus, finished. He's good to go. Let's say this happens a second time. So the guy violates the Isser Kares or the Isser Mises Bezdin a second time. And also, the Hisru boy, they gave him a warning, the Hirkin Beroisha, Ashasak, and again, Viter, he nods his head, he's quiet. Something goes wrong in the Hasra process. Viter, Ein Mamisim. I said, Malkanais is finished, he's good to go again, he's free to go. They didn't think. It says around Chazer Pam Shlishis, if this happens a third time, the Avar, and he violates it, the Hisru boy, and they warn him, Afal Pish Hirkin Beroisha, Ashasak, now, even if he just nods his head and so on, we imprison him until he dies. So that's what the Rambam is saying. So if a person violates a chiyuv kares, or any chiyuv mises bezdin, Rambam doesn't say dafka ritzich over here. Any kares violation and any mises bezdin, by the third time, he's imprisoned. So Achronim ask, it's a stira between the Rambam and Hilchos Ritzeach to the Rambam and Hilchos Sanhedrin. In Hilchos Ritzeach, the Rambam said clearly that this Indian of imprisoning until the person's killed, until the person dies, that's not for any chiyuv kares, and it's not even for any chiyuv mis. It's dafka ritzicha, and even for ritzicha, the Rambam said the person has to be a ratzchan, a harig nefashis, not just But now all of a sudden in Hilchos Sanhedrin, and the Rambam said clearly, if it's anything not that, then okay, then we don't do this. It comes around in Hilchos Sanhedrin and says no, any chiyuv kares or any chiyuv mises bezdin, by the third time he does it, if there's something that went wrong in the hasra or whatever, we imprison him until he dies. So I thought it's only for Ritzicha. So like this, there's a sefer that we have, without getting into the politics of it, it's hard to find these days, but it was a sefer that Tzitz Eliezer. So Tzitz Eliezer, in the younger years before the Chuvas Tzitz Eliezer, so he wrote a sefer called Hilchos Medina. Hilchos Medina is a lot of the Yishurim, I think maybe will be modeled after. Hilchos Medina is the halachas of setting up a government, al pi halacha. So there's all different sections. You can imagine, it's not in print anymore. But in Hilchos Medina, so Tzitz Eliezer deals with this Rambam. And Tzitz Eliezer says this is the solution. The answer is as follows. In Hilchos Ritzeach, the Rambam said over there, the guy that's a ratzchan, a harig nefashis, the Rambam didn't just say that he's imprisoned. The Rambam said he's imprisoned, and we kill him in prison. The whole thing, okay, feeding him this type of food, that type of food. That type of imprisonment, says the Rambam, that's for a ratzchan. That's something that's unique. And in Hilchos Sanhedrin, the Rambam is saying something else. The Rambam in Hilchos Sanhedrin doesn't say this whole procedure of killing the person. The Rambam just says, what the Rambam in Hilchos Sanhedrin is introducing us to is something else, which is called life imprisonment. That's something else. That if a person violates a chiyuv kares 3 times, or a chiyuv mises bezdin 3 times, then there is a punishment that's called life in prison. That when he says achiyomis, he means the person dies naturally. So there's 2 separate halachas. there is an imprisonment which is a which is killing the person, and that's for a ratzchan, that's for a harg nefashis. For another person who just violates, he's not a rat, he violates chiyuv kares or mises bezdin, again 3 times, and each time there's some issue that went wrong in the hasra or whatever. So then there's something else. It's also an imprisonment, but it's imprisonment, until he dies of natural death. That's when the Rambam says in Marmukah number 9 that this inyan of imprisonment and feeding him certain foods, v'chulu, until the person is killed. The Rambam says that this is only for a ratzchan. It doesn't mean but if it's not a ratzchan case, this entire formula is not in place. But the idea of machnisa naisalakip of imprisoning the person anshiyamas, that applies to all things. Again, if it's a chiyuv kares, he uses better than 3 times. Okay, so that's the unpleasantness. So we have so halacha l'maisa. What boils down is all these different categories of chavisha, of chavisha b'eisei yisurim. Again, you have case number 1 that's clearly rooted in Chazal. All these things that imprisonment, like as a holding situation until mises bezdin is clarified. You have another situation of chavisha b'eisei yisurim as a way of compelling a person to do the right thing, whether questionable. Rashi and the Rosh Shirley hold with such an idea. The Rashba might just not agree to the whole idea. Then you have this final situation of it being as a punishment. And there's different madregas to that punishment. A ratzchan, the punishment of imprisonment is mamish, it's a death sentence. And someone that's not a ratzchan but violates mises bezdin or kares multiple times, then there's a punishment of imprison, and that's just achiyamas. It's a life sentence, but it's not mamish killing the person. Okay. To be mamtik these dinim a little bit, so let's just mamish a couple minutes just to think a little bit. This union of imprisonment, everything in Yiddishkeit, again, it's all, everything we do, even if, it's all, everything Bezdin does dealing with people that violated halacha, violated mitzvahs, it's all trying to be masakin, it's all trying to fix. That's the idea. We're all trying to be masakin neshamas and masakin nefashas. If it's just a matter of keeping society function, then all the halachas of mises Bezdin and malchus, all these things, we could come up with maybe better ways to keep society at bay. All these halachas are really about being masakin the nefesh that was damaged, was injured because of that affair that the person did. And what we're seeing is that, again, throughout, whether it be mises bezdin, like the first example, or even monetary inyanim or other situations, this inyan of imprisonment, what is that doing to masakin the person? And maybe it'll shed some light on the rivash, right? That it's inappropriate for the person to be walking in the street. So it's like this. Take a look at Marmukah number 11. Obviously, this little piece of the Sefer Tanya that we're going to see together, he's not talking about, these elements of being in prison, but maybe. So the Tanya over there in Parak Mem Hey in Sefer Tanya, already at that part of Tanya, he's talking about different eitzes that a person can do to get them to wake up their nefesh elokis. Right? We know that it's all the side of the Sefer Tanya that every single one of us is made of 2 parts. You have your nefesh Bahamas, right? Bring you to low places. You have nefesh elokis that wants nothing but veikus b'Hashem. And sometimes for the average person, the nefesh elokis is dormant, is quiet. So how do you wake that up? So, and you can imagine the people that we're talking about, this morning, whatever the situation is, these are people that their nefesh elokis is very, very dormant. So says the Baal Tanya like this: so the Baal Tanya in Parak Mem Hey, it's good to see the whole parak over there. The Tanya over there in Parak Mem Hey says that even if everything else fails, if all the other eitzes that I mentioned until now of contemplating this and thinking about that and certain like this, nothing works. There is one mahalach which could stir up a nefesh elokis, and that is la'oyre b'machshavta tchila rachmim rab l'fnei Hashem al nitzitz elokos ha'machaya nafshay. It says about Tanya, it's about the one strategy is to awaken rachmim rabim, an unbelievable level of rachmanis ben Hashemayim, on the spark of Hashem's presence that's imprisoned within you. And so he says like this: if you think to yourself about your neshama, and you think where your neshama comes from, that it comes from the source of all life, the infinite one, Hamamalik Kol Almin that fills all worlds, V'Sayv Kol Almin and surrounds all worlds, L'Kul Kamei Kol Chashiv, and everything before him is mamish nothing. That's where your neshama comes from. That's the environment that your neshama is used to, being in that place of infinite. And what happens? And the neshama is taken from that place and is now clothed in the skin of the snake, right? It's put in this world. Harachak mi'arpnei hamelach, far from the light of the king's face. B'tachlis aherchak, in infinite distance. Umelech aser barahatim. Says Tanya, and the king, and the spark of, in your neshama, which is the spark of Hashem, is mamish in prison. Mamish in prison. Melech aser barahatim. V'usayd golsa shchina, and that's what the exile of divine presence is. It says about Tanya, to go back to Baal Shem, that when we talk about the Shekhinahs in Galus, so what does that mean? So like, you left Yerushalayim, now it's like somewhere else. The Shekhinah being Galus means us. It means who we're supposed to be and who we are deep down, being imprisoned in this prison that's called the Nefesh HaBahamis. That's the Galus HaShekhinah. That's called the divine presence in Galus. It's not somewhere, it could be in a very nice place. You could be in a nice restaurant, but you're mamish in prison. And the Galus is in prison, and the Shekhinah is in prison, because when your Nefesh Elokis is being held back by the Nefesh HaBahamis, that's called Hashem in prison. That's called you being in prison. And so the and so says the Baal Tanya that the Eitzah is to realize that and to think in such terms, and to realize that a sin that a person commits or a bad situation that they're in, it's not just a bad thing that they're doing. You're imprisoned, which means two things. It means that first of all, there's a piece of you, there's a part of you that's not this, that's divine, that's elevated, that's above this experience. But that part of you, which is so pure and so serene and so sublime, is being shackled because of this environment. And said about Tanya, everyone wants to be the hero that saves the princess, the knight in shining armor. That's a natural thing, especially for men. We want to do that. And so if you could imagine that that's what we're doing in life, for us to do our own tshuva and to help other yidden, what we're doing is rescuing the princess. We're going and we're saving the damsel in distress. And who's the damsel? Ourselves. Our own neshama is the damsel in distress. And we're releasing her from her prison. That itself, that very thought, said the Baal Tanya, not only motivates us, but it conjures up rachmim rabim. It evokes unbelievable compassion from the Rebbeinu Shalom for the piece of himself, kiviyachol, that's in prison. In other words, the Rebbeinu Shalom always responds in kind to us. If we're completely callous to the fact that the princess is in prison, then the Rebbeinu Shalom is also passive about it. But if we're distressed by that, by the imprisonment of our own nefesh elokis in our nefesh habahamis, then the Rebbeinu Shalom will also be impassioned by that, and there'll be an influx of rachamim on you, and automatically that itself will get you out of prison. So it says this is, in other words, what the Baal Tanya is telling us is an amazing idea, is that 2 points. First of all, every sin is be'etzim imprisonment. Every sin is imprisonment. It's the nefesh elokis being imprisoned by the nefesh habahamis, number one. Number two, and being sensitive to that is itself the way out of prison. Being sensitive to the fact that the nefesh elokis is imprisoned by the nefesh habahamis, it already itself evokes rachamim rabim from Shemayim on your nefesh elokis, and that itself will give it the strength to get out of prison. So when we're talking about this yid, whatever the situation is, like we just went through all the different situations, this yid's, he did not aveira. So Chazal have this inyan of imprisoning the person until the einish is carried. Whatever the situation is, what's the penimiyus of being? That's a tikkun for this guy. That's a tikkun for this guy, because that's what the avera was. The avera was an imprisonment of the nefesh elokis and the nefesh habahamis, and by him being sensitive to his own imprisonment, that evokes rachamim rabim on himself to get him out of that prison. So it's like the penimiyus of what the Rivash said. It's inappropriate for the guy to be walking in the street, and meanwhile, a din Torah is being worked out for him. Why? It's not just like, okay, on a pasha level, it's disrespectful, or I don't know, it's like not becoming, or whatever, however you want to say it. In penimiyus, it's like that's the avodah that he requires. The avodah that he needs right now is rachamim rabim on himself. And how do we evoke rachamim rabim? By him himself being sensitive to the fact that he's mamash chavish, or basis that he's in prison. So by him physically being in prison, that's reflective of the reality that he is in. So he is in prison, whether he realizes it or not. That's the point. He should be cognizant of the fact that he's taka in prison. And that's the need of basis Yisrael. No, Halacha l'maisa, it's the week of Shua Shechal, but we're taka in prison. The Golos, the Shechina is in Golos, And we have to, and being sensitive to that and thinking about that is itself ma'or rachim rabim, and that itself should be a way to get us out of our prison, befrat l'chlal, v'yas kol tzedek, me'er v'ymeinu.